Let's do it.
That would be different from all talks. How?
Yeah. Okay. All right. So I'm Todd OBoyle. I no longer work for a company named StrongArm because we got bought by WatchGuard Technologies. So I now work for WatchGuard. My slides have left the building. And I am going to talk about okay. That's a little odd. So I'm going to talk about the role of people in security programs and just how important they are. And this is really focused on some research that we did while I and some of my colleagues were at a company called MITRE that does research and development for the federal government. And it's more of a think piece. I'm not going to give you a tool. I'm going to give you some ideas and some real world and research results. And there's a little exercise at the end, for you to think about different ways that you can bring people into your security program. So you probably don't know who I am. I started in the Sirius Center that Gene Spafford runs at Purdue. So I'm a security lifer. I went to MITRE straight out of college and did tours all over the world in defense and intelligence, and split my time between being on the opposite end of the barrel from nation states and doing research and development. And StrongArm was one of our research projects, which we turned into a company and eventually sold. So the problem statement for the research at MITRE was that no matter what us our good people did on the right, what the defenders did, the attackers for years and years and years would respond equally. And so I'll just kind of go down this list back and forth. So we were dealing with an attack where there was some sensitive data hosted on an unsecured web app. This was a long time ago. And so, not that people still don't do that, right? Dropbox and S3 buckets and, with passwords and sometimes even classified in it. And so, found that somebody that is not friendly to the nation was accessing this web application. So our response was, we are going to implement domain filtering. So if they're not coming from a .com or they're not coming from a .mil or .gov, they don't get access to this information. That's going to work, right? Of course not. So the attackers found ways into a trusted site and then proxied through it. So just to give you some metrics here. So it took us 2 or 3 months to implement that domain filtering. The attackers found their way in through the proxies in about a week. Took them about a week to figure it out. So we're starting to see 2 to 3 months on the defensive side, about a week on the attacker side. So eventually we find that these people keep showing up, and so we're going to implement user IDs and passwords. And we kind of all know where this goes. They found a weakness in the password reset process, and was able to change a password of a user from somewhere else. And so, what are we going to do now? And so we went through this effort to put more checks in the password reset process, put more forms and bureaucracy in the account provisioning process, thinking that we had them. And so what happened in this case? So it took us about 3 to 6 months to implement those hardening efforts, and the attackers were able to social engineer their way through it. It did take them about a month because we were able to, based on the processes we improved, we actually found them a couple of times trying to apply for accounts. So, yay. But eventually they were able to completely subvert the process and social engineer their way in. So it took them, less than a month. So at this point, we're like 5 steps into this game, and we're starting to scratch our heads of, well, maybe all these things that we do, all of this process improvement and buying new technology to become more secure, maybe it's just kind of a losing game. But at the same time, we made a $100 million smart card rollout decision. So we're going to keep going down that path of buying more stuff and giving that stuff to more people. Smart card implementation, if you've ever done it, it's a real joy. It's a real joy, and it's especially cheap. So hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars, and years later, and the attackers simply moved. They went somewhere else. The information was in that other place. And so by this time, we're sitting at the end of the table, and we've had to explain to the bosses 5 times now that we got hacked, and we've got a technical solution to fix this problem. And so by the 5th time we have to have this conversation, they stop believing us. They just flat out say, these things that you guys are doing, I don't trust you anymore. And so at that point, we started to think about what some of our options were. Like, clearly this problem isn't going to go away, and a certain set of information is the target. And so what could we do? And so the first thing we did was start to study how attackers operate. Some of these studies, this has a kill chain reference from Lockheed Martin, but some of these studies have grown into the attack framework from MITRE. Just really understanding how attackers go about their jobs, so that we can try and find weaknesses, which is also the goal of an attack. And so one of the things we had thought about was, malware was used in a number of cases of these attacks. And so this is what malware actually looks like on the network. This is how it talks for those who aren't malware experts. It tends to be the victim speaks first. And so it phones home to a server on the internet, and that server can the attacker controls and can give commands back to the victim. And so the beauty of this is it bypasses just about all the firewalls out there, because we're really good at blocking things from coming in, really bad at blocking things from going out. And the other nice thing about this is even through all of these exchanges from the poor victim to the attacker, what this looks like on a network is something like this. And so even if you are lucky enough to be able to find this traffic, this is about how much you know about it. And so we kind of started scratching our heads again, and maybe we can hack this malware. We were technical people and started with a technical solution. And so that's actually what we did. The StrongArm research that even well before we turned it into a product was basically a man-in-the-middle proxy for malware. And so you can actually see all of these things now. And not only can you see them, what we would do is put some control in the middle. So say they wanted to download everything in the documents folder. We could give them back, we were in the middle, so we could give them back all kinds of results, and also capture these things so that we know like what their targets are, where they're browsing, where else they might be in the network, simply by observing them living in the network. And so while this is moderately interesting, I think the real paradigm shift for us was if you're playing whack-a-mole and your initial response is get them out, get them out, get them out, and say they're in 5 places and you just turned off one. You just disabled the only thing that you know about the attacker. And so by changing your mindset about how to respond, maybe leaving them in is the right thing to do sometimes. So we, in the case of this research, these were the kinds of things that we could observe, some technical observables. And so with that philosophy, we took the research to the next level. Maybe we can get in the head of the attackers. And so we linked up with some social scientists who had been doing work in the government. And they were experts in the field of denial and deception. And if you've never read this book, I highly recommend it. I have a whole reading list at the end that you can take a picture of it. But the Farewell dossier Farewell was a KGB agent who defected to France and ended up in the French embassy, or ended up in French custody because he wanted to live in the West. And he was an expert in, the Russians were running programs in Canada because the Canadians knew how to move oil through really cold places, through the Arctic. And the Russians had found oil, but they didn't have any way to move it. They couldn't get it out of Siberia because their pipelines would not function. And so what happened was, based upon this information, the French contacted us and the Canadians and said, here's a ring of Russian spies living in Canada. You may want to go deal with this. And so working with the Canadians, and instead of going and rounding up this whole spy ring, because they probably stole a bunch of what they had needed already. Instead, we created a whole bunch of materials on how pipelines work and left them in this company so that they could be stolen. And about a year later, there was a catastrophic event on the Siberian pipeline. May or may not, we don't know, whether the effect was from these documents or not. But even more importantly, the KGB went crazy, not trusting the information that was stolen from the West, and they began to purge all of their coffers, all the intelligence they'd collected for the last 40 years. This was the 80s. They didn't trust any of it, and so that's a real powerful thought when you think about dealing with asymmetry in security. And so we did this. So we had a red team that was full of intelligence professionals, and these intelligence professionals had information targets. They were actually trying to build an understanding of what the blue team was going to do, where they are operating, and why. And the blue team's job was simply to ensure that the mission was successful. It wasn't the blue team's job. Note that this says the blue team's job wasn't to keep all of the information safe. In fact, sometimes you want it to get stolen. So what happened was the blue team, augmented with some of these deception experts, was able to root out a bunch of accesses and feed the red team the information that they wanted the red team to know. And based upon this, the red team, their assessments were just wrong. And so all of these operations that the red team was doing to steal information were all fruitless because you couldn't tell right from wrong. And so they made bad decisions. And if they ever, once we told them at the end that they had been had, they kind of did a brain dump of how they would respond, what they could trust, what they didn't want to trust. And basically their trust in the operations against the blue team was so low that they said they probably wouldn't go do that again, which is an interesting assessment. Another interesting assessment that we found when we were talking with the deception experts was, they were used to feeding physical documents to people who've penetrated organizations, maybe leaving some information in dumpsters for people to find, for attackers to find. But when we started talking about all of the accesses that the red team had, email boxes are an important component. Access to online documents via Drive or OneDrive or Dropbox. User IDs and passwords for web apps. These were all things that the red team had. They were accesses that the red team had, and the blue team could use those to seed see their the disinformation that they were given. And eventually what happened was we built up enough of a rhythm over the course of this experiment, which was a few weeks in duration, where we could see which email boxes were actually compromised based upon the actions that the red team were taking. So the blue team effectively was able to go on the offense against the red team simply by watching for characteristics of leave a user ID and password in a mailbox and watch them visit the website. You know, those kinds of fun things. And so at this point, this was about 10 years ago, my mindset switched from being technical and really focused on patching systems and making sure that they're configured in the right way and stopping certain traffic from going here and there. And after all of this research, I did a 180 off that point. I kind of don't care how much security infrastructure you got. If you are a target, an attacker is going to come after you, and they're going to get what they want. And so, being prepared for that is one of the first things that I always recommended for a security program, and then changing how you respond. And so, on the preparation side, even back in these days, 15, 20 years ago, when this work started, phishing attacks were used almost exclusively to get this access started. They weren't breaking into SQL servers to get access to this stuff. They were subverting people. They were subverting processes. And given the statistic, we decided to kind of put some effort into that. And even with all this experience, I firmly believe that this would never work. And I've never been more wrong about something in my entire life. That this user education thing really works. And so how we rolled out our phishing education programs is just getting out and talking to people. It starts with those simple things. In our case, we started with the executives. One nice thing is the executives were getting targeted in many of these cases. And so you get to go in and say, you were targeted by an email phish. An attacker wants access to your email box. We've seen them attack these other kinds of people, either in the organization or in a third party. And we think that they're after financial information. We think that they're after personal information. And so when you bring that conversation to the executive and really talk about why the attacker is going after them, it turns security from this boogeyman thing into a business problem. And their eyes kind of light up. And then what we did was continue the conversation with those executives. And one at a time, you're not going to get every executive, but one at a time, we started to get them on our side. And then eventually, they kind of made a game out of it. Like getting targeted was some sort of bravado. Like my people were targeted 5 times this week, and your people were only targeted 2. Looks like my programs are more important. And so, because the executives were talking at this level, functionally about what phishing attacks and really security in general, they made their organization serious about it. So they talked about it at town halls. Like logistics people and finance people and HR people are talking about security at their town hall meetings. And it's not just the IT people blathering on. And so, ultimately, hacking your people is get them talking to you, first of all, by not shaming them and being nice. And get them talking to each other, because they... I have a story about that that I'll share in a moment. because them talking to each other and reporting the phishes that they see is one of the only ways that we've found to be effective against highly targeted attacks. And so even from StrongArm, we have our product was focused on small, mid-sized businesses, and so it was a materials firm that had signed up, and what we do is it's kind of like OpenDNS, and we use the DNS to take control of traffic to phishing sites or other types of malicious websites, and then we also allow people to report phishes, and we do some triage. And so what had happened in this case was one of their salespeople was targeted by, we don't know, targeted, and it was the domain used in the email was one letter off from one of their accounts. So this is a salesperson thinking they got an email from one of their accounts with one letter off, and it was a Scandinavian name. It was an extra syllable. Like you really can't blame them. There's no amount of education that that's going to help you spot this extra L. But what happened was the attacker was able to get into their mailbox. They weren't using any multi-factor auth or anything, and they lived in the mailbox for about a week. They were stealing bids. So if you are a materials firm and your bids are gushing out the door, what could your bids be used for? Right? And so I'll get back to that. About a week later, the attacker got a little bold, and they started sending email as this compromised salesperson inside the company and outside as well. And one of their colleagues went up to him and said, "Hey, I got this really weird email from you that said open this attachment, and it didn't work. Can you resend that to me?" "I didn't send you any emails." And so they went and talked to IT and started to get to the bottom of this. And actually, the two people talking is what found the attack. And we went back in time and found that the attacker had set up this domain, registered a certificate the previous week. Set up the phishing site, the whole 9 yards, everything. It looks good. It was a branded Outlook. It was branded Outlook Web Access, so it was branded to the company, to the target. So the tradecraft here was pretty good. And so what happened was the IT people, by doing this analysis and understanding that it was a salesperson getting targeted, and the tradecraft was high, and that they were probably after stealing bids. This is a conversation you can have with a vice president of sales. This is a conversation you can have with the CEO of a company about what the business impact of a security attack is, and that's exactly what happened. And the beauty of it was the IT people had been stuck on rolling out multi-factor authentication to the users because they were just resistant. I don't want to type in this stupid number. It stinks. I don't want to hit OK on that little app on my phone. And after this incident, the CEO just said, "Do it. Here, what kind of resources do you need?" And so you can use breaches. Once you can convert it into something that matters to the business, use the breaches to improve your security program, which means that you have to understand what you want next on your roadmap in order to stop some of these kinds of attacks. But that's a totally different talk all into this thing. And so at this time, normally I just open it up to the audience to have a conversation about fun ways you've hacked your organization, especially the people in your organization. And maybe you've done something awesome with phishing education. Maybe you've done you've convinced somebody by using an attack to provide some funding or other types of people resources so that you can get bolster your security program. So does anybody have any fun stories to share? I have a couple. If I get dead silence from the audience. Yes, in the back.
big, but one of the things I did is I'm starting up a cybersecurity training organization. And one of the things I did is the precursor to that is I did a free training just to admin and just showing them how secure my password on, and I think it is US engineer, it's nice. And explaining to them, using phrases instead of just the one word password, just following these guys and going that extra mile to make a real difference in security of your account. It made an impact. One lady from after desk immediately changed her password, something far more secure, and changed all the ones at home also. So just taking the time to explain to them using the resource gap and in your tool belt really help out.
Yeah, and so if you didn't hear from the back of the room, he had through engagement and sending people tips over to websites on how secure is your password, got some results. People are setting up better passwords, and something that we've done as well is once you're living in the breach and you kind of make it through triage, it's a really great time to suggest something. If passwords are a target, things like password managers and the importance of not using a password twice, given these the DocuSign breaches and LinkedIn, Yahoo, the list goes on. If you're reusing a password on the internet these days, you're in big trouble. So having little things in your hip pocket like, here's a password manager for you to use. Let me turn on MFA for your Office 365 account. Like right now, let's do it right now. Like striking while the iron's hot is a really effective way to get some of these little things rolled out. By going after people.
Yeah, so I did a webinar a little while ago with a CIO in the UK, and he had a great thing. I thought it was great that he did it, but once every 2 weeks or so, he would just set up an open office in the break room area where everybody eats lunch, where the company goes to meet up their food, whatever, and he just sets up at the table and invites people to come and ask him whatever questions, like about tech stuff, like you have a phone that you don't know how to light, you want to sell it, but you're afraid that you're going to leave your information on it, and so people know every Thursday afternoon between these hours he's going to be sitting there, and then you just ask all their security questions, technical questions, whatever, and starts all these cool conversations that he'd never have with other employees in the company otherwise. So then he says, that leads to them saying, hey, I got these weird emails. Like they actually come to him with stuff that could really save the company's name in some cases.
Yeah. That's a fun idea. Man, I totally had a thought while you were saying that, but now it's vanished. It's gone. It's fleeted. It has fleeted. Yeah. So this concept of that's what it was. Really connecting. As a security person, the importance of connecting with other people in your organization, so that they understand, some of the issues that are out there, is of the utmost importance. So any way you can get out of the office, go talk at a water cooler, do a lunch and learn. We have a guy that I do talks with who does regular email blasts and like measures engagement, and then gives people more relevant topics. He's actually like kind of this IT security marketing inside of a little company. So he's come up with these really interesting ideas for engagement, and it's something I encourage everybody to do, and you might make a friend. So that's all I've got. This is the reading list that I had mentioned earlier. It's got books on intelligence and counterintelligence. So how to spy and how to not be spied on. And some of the security books that I grew up with. Masters of Deception, Takedown, the Cuckoo's Egg, of course, being a MITRE guy. The MITRE played a big role in the Cuckoo's Egg. If you've never read the Cuckoo's Egg, that's table stakes. Okay, so I'll take any questions on the talk if people want to. If people have any questions. Yes.
So what did you do with the StrongArm man in the middle? What was the point of that exercise and how did it work out for you?
So the question was, what did we end up doing with this man in the middle software? And so I'll tell that story. So MITRE is it's called a federally funded research and development center, an FFRDC. And it's part of the National Lab Network. It does research for the government. And in 2009, the president signed a memo directing the labs to spin out more companies from the government to create American businesses and to get some of the U.S. spends I think $100 billion on R&D in the Defense Department alone. So let's build some businesses out of that $100 billion. And so we were approached by a VC firm that focused on that, that takes ideas and research level prototypes and turns them into products. And so what we did was we tried to take our original hypothesis, so that man in the middle thing, and sell it to somebody, and people wouldn't touch it with a 10-foot pole. But what we did end up doing was, let me go back to that picture. It's somewhat helpful. So this thing right here ended up being our StrongArm product, and we broke it in half. So we took this part of the technology, so talking to the victim and being able to speak malware. So this became the core of our StrongArm product, and it was a DNS-based black hole. So you could redirect traffic over to it, and it could actually talk malware back to the victim. And so that was really what we brought to market first. So if you're like an OpenDNS user, or there's a couple of other Titan, WebTitan is very similar to that. We had a product that was equal to that, except for it could speak malware. And then what we actually did that was interesting was so that malware, it works to talk to malware when you're actually speaking to a malware. Many times when people click on phishing links, you're talking to a human on the other end. And so we had a partnership with KnowBe4 and used some of the KnowBe4 educational content and customized messages from the IT admin or whatever, so that the human would get a dose of education when they made the mistake. And that's also a really great time to educate them. Not just get them to try out new tech, but give them a little dose of education that they'll remember.
What you just did could have ended really badly.
Yeah.
This is only a test.
It's cool. It's cool. Yeah. So here's how you don't do that again. And so the content, the game and education content is one thing. But what is also fun is that message from the IT admins. You just clicked on a phish. Forward me that email you just clicked on. Come talk to me. Go talk to your boss if you're a big enough company, and you could roll out like a real. You could tell all the vice presidents about phishing, and they could have conversations with their employees. So there's all kinds of interesting things you can do. If you simply engage users when they've made mistakes, and you can do all those things even without buying a product. So we took this side of it. So it's essentially the client component of the malware. And this would be the attacker's command and control server. And if people know what Shodan is, it finds stuff on the internet that you don't want to be found. And so we did a bunch of work with Shodan to be able to fingerprint to command and control servers on the internet. And so we did some of the work, and they did some of the work, so that when you see results in Shodan from malware, that's the kind of thing that we did. And so part of our product is finding where attackers are setting themselves up. So one of the things we monitor now is the Let's Encrypt certificate feed. Because attackers have, Todd's professional opinion is the verification that's put into Let's Encrypt is way too weak for attackers. And so what they're doing is all you have to do in order to register a certificate with Let's Encrypt is have control of a server on the internet. That's it. You can register any domain you would like with Let's Encrypt as long as you can receive traffic from that domain. And so like the off by one letter certificate, no problem, no verification issues at all. And things like brand typo squatting, all those domains that get registered for brand typo squatting there are Let's Encrypt certificates being issued for those. And so we pay attention to that kind of data and would add that to our data feeds. And we use this kind of information similar to that. Okay, long-winded answer. Okay, if there's no more questions, do you have a question? You good? Okay. Awesome. I'll give you guys back some time. Thanks.